The ring was still on her cousin's finger when Margot Selby walked through the servants' entrance of Thornfield Hall. No one at the back door thought to look twice at her. She wore a gray wool dress 2 sizes too large, borrowed from the innkeeper's wife in the village, and she carried a canvas bag that contained everything she had been permitted to keep after the lawyers finished their work. The housekeeper, a brisk woman named Mrs. Tatum, had glanced at her references, forged but carefully, and said, "Tuesday through Sunday, half day off Thursday, you start in the linen room." Margot had said, "Yes, ma'am," and meant it entirely. She had been told growing up that she had her grandmother's composure. It was not a compliment exactly. Her grandmother had been described by people who loved her as difficult, and by people who didn't as worse than that. What it meant in practice was that Margot had a way of going still when things went badly, of setting her expression into something that gave nothing away, of continuing to function through circumstances that would have caused other people to sit down and refuse to move until someone fixed it. She used that composure now. She used it walking past the kitchen maids who didn't look up from their work. She used it climbing the back stairs to the linen room, which was smaller than the closet she'd had in her father's house, which was the house she was in, which had belonged to her family for 4 generations and now belonged, on paper, to her cousin's husband, which was a sentence she had not yet found a way to say without something tightening behind her sternum. She set her canvas bag down on the narrow cot. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the wall. The ring had been her mother's, her grandmother's before that. It was not particularly valuable in the way that things are valuable to solicitors and estate appraisers. A small oval sapphire in a plain gold setting, modest by the standards of what the Selby family had once owned. But her mother had worn it every day of her life until the day she couldn't, and she had told Margot once that it was the thing she would want passed on regardless of what else happened. Not the silver, not the paintings, not the portrait above the mantel in the east parlor, the ring. Margot's father had made a note of it, in his will, in his own handwriting, in the margins beside the formal language his solicitor had drafted. The sapphire ring to Margot, specifically, as her mother wished. Her cousin Vivienne had been wearing it at the funeral. Margot had not said anything. There had been people watching, and Vivienne's husband had been standing at Vivienne's shoulder with the particular satisfaction of a man who has recently acquired something and intends to keep acquiring it, and Margot had learned by then, not quickly, but thoroughly, that the people who had rewritten the terms of her inheritance were not operating on a system where objections were received and considered. They were operating on a system where objections were used as evidence that the person making them was unstable, emotional, and therefore exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be trusted with anything valuable. So she had said nothing. She had watched the ring catch the light on Vivienne's hand and filed it away with the same careful attention she had given to everything else she'd needed to remember. And she had begun, quietly, to plan. The plan had brought her here, to a linen room on the 3rd floor of a house she had lived in until she was 22. A house where she knew which steps creaked and which windows stuck, and where her father had kept the documents he considered important, and where a solicitor named Mr. Hadley had once told her, 3 weeks before her father's death and 4 months before the will, that appeared for probate had apparently been written, that her father's intentions for the estate were very clear, and she should not worry. She was not worrying. She was doing something more useful than worrying. She started in the linen room, and she did the work correctly, and she kept her eyes open. The Duke of Thornfield, Alistair Rowe, to the county's solicitors and bankers, and to no one else in particular, was not what she had expected. This was an admission she made privately on her 3rd day, when she was called up to dust the library while the family was at church, and she had a full hour in the room that mattered most to her, the room where her father had worked, the room where the ledgers and correspondence and filing cases that represented the estate's administrative memory had always lived. She had expected the library to have changed. Vivian's husband, Mr. Karsten, a man whose fortune came from coal and whose taste came from a catalog, had changed everything else. New curtains in the front parlor, new carpets in the hall, new everything in the dining room, chosen with the particular aggression of someone who wants to overwrite the previous tenants as efficiently as possible. The library had not been touched. She noticed this first and then noticed, in looking around more carefully, that the library had not been touched because it was in current use. The desk had papers on it, real papers, the working kind. The shelves showed evidence of things being taken down and returned. There was a glass with the dried ring of something at the bottom that a housemaid had apparently missed, which meant someone had been in here recently enough that the housemaid's most recent pass hadn't caught it. The Duke of Thornfield was using her father's library. She had not expected the room to still feel like her father's. She had not expected to have to stand in the doorway for a moment before she could go in. She went in. She dusted. She did not open any drawers, did not look at any papers, did not do anything that could not be explained if someone walked in. She was here to understand the landscape, not to move through it yet. She was nearly finished when she heard him on the stairs. Not heavy footsteps, which she'd half anticipated from the limited information she had about Alistair Rowe. He'd inherited the estate 6 months ago from a distant relation, had a reputation in London for being methodical and very difficult to surprise, was 34, unmarried, and had arrived at Thornfield in the autumn with 2 trunks and his own horse, and had dismissed most of the previous household staff. Not her. She had come after. The footsteps were measured. The door opened and he came in without looking up from the letter he was reading, and Margot was in the corner near the window with a dust cloth in her hand, and nowhere particular to go. He looked up when he reached the desk. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back in the way she had learned to look at people in the last several months, directly, without expression, the way a person looks when they have decided not to give anything away. He said nothing about her being there. He set the letter on the desk, sat down, and then, with the focused attention of someone who had registered something without addressing it yet, said, "You've done the east shelf, but not the west." "I'll do the west next," she said. "The west do the west next," she said. "The west has the older volumes. Some of them shouldn't be dusted with a dry cloth. There's a soft brush in the second drawer of the sideboard." She found the brush. She did the west shelf. He read his letter. When she was nearly done, he said, still looking at the letter, "You knew which volumes those were." It was not a question. She had moved through the older section with the particular careful attention of someone who had handled those books before, who knew the difference between the ones that needed gentle treatment and the ones that were sturdy enough to not require it. "The spines were fragile," she said. Anyone could see that. He looked up then. He looked at her for a longer moment than the question required. "What's your name?" he said. "Marsh," she said, the name she'd given Mrs. Tatum. "Margaret Marsh." He nodded, looked back down. She finished the shelf and left. She thought about that look for the rest of the day. Not because it had been unkind, because it hadn't been dismissive either. It had been the look of someone who was paying attention and had noticed something, and was filing it away without announcing what the something was. She recognized it because she did the same thing. The document she was looking for was not in the library. She had suspected this. Her father had been a careful man, not secretive, not paranoid, but careful in the way that people are careful when they have spent enough years managing an estate to understand that certain things should not be easy to find if the wrong person came looking. He had told her once, over the maps table in the back study, that he kept the things that mattered in three places, and none of them were obvious, and that she would know where to look if she ever needed to. She had thought, at the time, that this was the kind of thing fathers said when they were trying to feel prepared for circumstances they expected never to happen. She had not written it down. She had not needed to. He had said it with the particular seriousness of someone making sure she was listening. And she had listened. The first place was the library, in the bottom row of the north-facing shelves, behind the volumes of estate survey records that no one had opened in decades. She had gotten to those on her fourth day, under the pretense of organizing, and found only the surveys. The second place was the back study, which was now used as a secondary sitting room, and had been reorganized to the point where it was unrecognizable. The third place was the garden room. The garden room was at the end of the east wing, and it was, as far as Margot could determine, the only room in the house that no one in the current household used for anything. It had been her mother's room. Not a formal parlor, not a morning room in the designation sense, but the room where her mother had actually spent her time, where she had kept her plants, and her correspondence, and her opinions about things. After her mother's death, her father had locked it. The key had been on a hook in his study, labeled in his handwriting, and the key was gone now, and the room was locked, and when Margot had walked past it on her first day, she had pressed her hand briefly against the door and then kept moving because she had not yet figured out how to get in without being noticed. She was thinking about this at breakfast, the servants' breakfast, which she ate in the kitchen at the long table with the other housemaids and the footmen and the cook, who was a woman named Mrs. Fenn, and who had been at Thornfield since before Margot was born, and who had mercifully not recognized her. When the Duke appeared in the kitchen doorway, this did not appear to be up. Mrs. Fenn barely looked up. Several of the other staff glanced over and went back to their plates. "Mrs. Fenn," he said, "the coffee this morning was different. New supplier from the village," Mrs. Fenn said. "Mr. Grist's arrangement fell through." "It was better," he said. "Can you source more from whoever did this batch?" Mrs. Fenn said she could and would. He nodded. He was about to go when his gaze moved down the table and stopped on Margot. She was looking at her plate. She had been looking at her plate. She had not looked up because she was being careful, because looking up was not what a housemaid did when the Duke came into the kitchen, and also because she was thinking about the garden room and had been momentarily less focused on the performance than she should have been. "Marsh," he said. She looked up. "The Hollings ledgers, in the library, the ones from 1808 through 1814. Have you moved them while organizing?" She had not moved them. She had looked at them because they were the ones she had originally thought her father might have used as concealment, and they were still in the same place they'd always been, which was the third shelf from the bottom on the east wall. And she knew this with a specificity that had nothing to do with being a housemaid who had been here less than a week. "They're on the east wall," she said. "Third shelf from the bottom. I haven't moved them." A pause. "How do you know where the east wall is in relation to where you were working?" The kitchen was very quiet in the way that kitchens go quiet when something is happening that the people in them are not supposed to be paying attention to. "I can tell east by the window light," she said. "The library faces east. The shelves on that wall get the morning sun." He looked at her for a long moment, the same look from the first day. Whatever he was doing with it, he was doing it consistently. "Thank you," he said. He left. Mrs. Fenn was quiet for a beat, and then said something to the cook's assistant about the new flour supplier. And everyone went back to eating. And Margot kept her eyes on her plate and breathed carefully and told herself that she was fine, that she had handled that, that 2 correct answers about library geography were not evidence of anything they shouldn't be. But that evening, just before supper, a folded note was passed to her by one of the footmen. It said, in a handwriting she didn't recognize, "The garden room key is on the hook by the back study door. I have taken the liberty of leaving it unlocked this evening. I find I have questions about the room if you have answers." It was not signed. She sat with the note for a full minute, then she folded it and put it in her pocket and went, after supper, to the east wing. He was already there. He was standing at the window with his back to the door when she came in, and the room smelled the way she remembered it. Her mother's plants were long dead, but the smell of the room had never entirely left, something green and faintly particular, the smell of a place that had been loved consistently in one direction for long enough to hold it. She stopped in the doorway. He turned. He looked at her. Then he looked at the room around her, at the expression she couldn't stop herself from having, the specific expression of walking back into somewhere you thought you'd lost. "You've been here before," he said. It was not a question. He had stopped asking questions the way people ask questions when they're looking for confirmation. He had started asking them the way people ask when they've already confirmed and are giving you an opportunity to catch up. She could have deflected. She had been deflecting for 5 months, across 3 counties, through 2 legal consultations that went nowhere and one that might go somewhere eventually, and she had become very good at the particular art of saying something true that was not the thing being asked. So she was tired of it in a way she hadn't fully registered until this moment, standing in her mother's room in front of a man who had clearly known something was wrong since the first day. "I grew up here," she said. The room was very quiet. "Margot Selby," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, with the expression of a man receiving information he had anticipated and is now integrating into a framework that was waiting for it. "I found the ledgers," he said. She went still. He crossed to the writing desk, her mother's desk, the small walnut one that she'd had brought from her family home when she married, and opened the drawer that Margot had not been able to reach because it had been locked, and she had not yet worked out how to get to it without being seen. He produced a folded packet of documents and set them on the desk surface. "There's a false bottom," he said. "Your mother built this desk herself, I believe, or had it built to her specifications. The drawer has 2 compartments. The second one isn't visible if you don't know to look." Margot looked at the documents. "I found them 3 weeks ago when I was trying to understand why the previous management's accounting records had a 4-year gap," he said. "I was looking for documentation that would explain it. What I found instead was a packet addressed to you." She crossed the room. She picked up the documents. On the outside of the packet, in her father's handwriting, "For Margot. When she comes back for it." He had known. He had known she would need to come back for it, had known she would know to look here, had known enough about whatever was coming to prepare for the specific possibility that she would need to find this herself rather than have it given to her. Her throat tightened. She did not look up. "I haven't read them," the Duke said. He said it simply, without asking for anything in return. "I couldn't. They're addressed to you." She pressed her hand flat against the packet. The paper was cold and slightly damp from the years, but intact. Her father's handwriting on the outside, confident even in the writing, even in the preparation for a circumstance she knew he had hoped wouldn't come. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since the second day. The way you moved through the library." He paused. "I grew up in houses with books. People who grew up around a particular collection move through it differently than people who haven't. You moved through that library as though you knew the geography of it before you looked, and you didn't say anything." "I was waiting to understand more," he said. "And I thought that if I said something too soon, you would leave. Whatever you came back for, you hadn't found it yet." She looked up at him. "You could have simply asked me." "I could have," he said. "Would you have told me?" A silence. Outside the window, the evening was settling in, the particular blue-gray of early autumn, the light doing something honest and low across the east lawn. "No," she said, "not then." "I know," he said, "so I waited." She looked at the packet in her hands. She thought about 5 months, about Vivian's ring on the wrong hand, about a will that had been filed for probate that bore her father's name but not his intentions, not the careful and specific instructions he had given his solicitor in the autumn before he died, the ones Mr. Hadley had told her about, and which had apparently evaporated between that conversation and the document that appeared afterward, the document that gave Vivian's husband guardianship of the estate and left Margot with a small annual sum and the clothes on her back. "There's a solicitor," she said. "His name is Mr. Hadley. He knew my father. He was there when my father drafted the original will, the real one, not the one that was submitted." "I know who Mr. Hadley is," the Duke said. "I wrote to him 6 weeks ago." She looked at him sharply. "He wrote back," the Duke said. "He's been waiting. He told me he had been looking for a way to address the matter for months and had not been able to find the correct legal footing to proceed without your involvement. He needs you, and he needs whatever is in that packet." She held the packet. She thought about her father making a false bottom in her mother's desk, putting documents in it, writing her name on the outside in his particular cramped hand. She thought about him knowing that this might happen, building the precaution before he died, trusting that she would come back to the right place at the right time. He had not been wrong. He had only been wrong about how long it would take her to get here. "He wrote that the ring was my mother's," she said, not looking up. "In the original will. He specified it. Then we'll get it back," the Duke said. She looked at him. He said it the way he seemed to say everything, without drama, without needing her to thank him for it, as though it were simply the next thing that needed to happen, and he was prepared to see that it did. "You've only known me a week," she said. "I've known something was wrong since the first day," he said. "That's longer." Mr. Hadley arrived on a Wednesday. He was a small man, deliberate, with the careful posture of someone who had spent a career in rooms where precision mattered and had learned to move accordingly. He shook the Duke's hand in the entrance hall and then turned to Margot, he said. "You look like your mother," he said. Not the beginning of a longer sentence. Just that, delivered with the directness of a man who had been holding it for a while. "I've been told," she said. She had very good judgment, he said, about most things. About which room to put her desk in, specifically. He sat down at the library table, which was where the Duke had arranged for the meeting to happen, because some things, he had said simply, were better done in rooms that had been used correctly for a long time. Mr. Hadley opened his case. What he removed was familiar to Margot in the way that certain things are familiar, not because you have seen them, but because someone has described them to you with enough specificity that you have built a picture. Her father's will, the real one, witnessed by Mr. Hadley personally, and by 2 additional witnesses whose names she didn't recognize, but who Mr. Hadley informed them were both still living, and both prepared to attest to the document's authenticity. Beside it, he placed the document that had been submitted for probate. Even without reading them, she could see they were not the same length. "Your cousin's husband had access to the house for 3 weeks between your father's death and the formal proceedings," Mr. Hadley said. "I have not been able to prove, to date, precisely how the exchange was made. I have been able to demonstrate, through the testimony I've gathered and the document examination I commissioned, that the submitted will does not match the witness signatures. The handwriting on 2 of the 3 signatures does not match the records I have from the same witnesses in other documents of the same period." The Duke looked at the 2 documents side by side. "This was filed with the county clerk's office?" Yes. There was no challenge at the time because Miss Selby was not informed of its contents until the estate had already transferred. Margot looked at the table. I wasn't shown the will at all. I was told the estate couldn't sustain 2 households. I was told there was a trust established for my maintenance. I was told I should be grateful for the arrangement and not cause difficulty. The room was quiet. And the trust, the Duke said. Does not exist, Mr. Hadley said. There is no trust. Your father established one in the original will, a separate arrangement specifically protected. It has never been administered because the people responsible for administering it chose not to mention it. He looked at Margot over his spectacles. It has been accumulating for 5 months. She looked at the wall for a moment. The Duke said nothing. She had noticed this about him. He did not fill silences with things that didn't need to be said. He waited with the patience of a man who understood that some information needed room before anything else could happen. The documents in the packet, she said. She put them on the table, slid them toward Mr. Hadley. My father left them in my mother's desk. Mr. Hadley opened the packet. He read in silence for several minutes. Once, toward the middle, something shifted in his expression. Not quite emotion, but the controlled response of someone who has found a thing they were hoping to find. He knew, Mr. Hadley said. He wasn't certain it would happen. But he prepared for the possibility. He set the documents down. This is a signed statement of his intentions, witnessed separately from the will, dated 2 weeks before his death. He was very specific. He looked at Margot. He wrote that the ring was to go to you. He wrote that the estate was to be managed according to the terms he had outlined with me. And he wrote, he paused, choosing something from the page, that you were not to be made to feel that your presence in this house was conditional, that it was yours by right and by love, and that anyone who suggested otherwise should be referred to his solicitor. She picked up the page. She found the section. She read it herself. She had her father's handwriting in her hand, his margins, his corrections, his particular cramped way of writing that she had spent her whole childhood watching scratch across ledgers and letters, and once, memorably, a very firm note to the tenant in the East Cottage about the fence situation. She read the relevant section twice. Then she set it down. He left the house to me, she said, specifically and unambiguously. Mr. Hadley said. The Duke was watching her. She could feel it without looking up. And the statement has legal standing, she said. Combined with the original will, the witness testimony I've gathered, and the document examination findings, yes, significantly so. He allowed himself a brief pause. Your cousin's husband will have difficulty maintaining his position. His solicitor is already, I suspect, aware that the situation has become precarious. I received a letter 2 days ago from a firm I don't recognize that was asking very general questions about estate succession law. I expect we will hear from them again with more specific questions once they understand what we have. Margot looked at the 2 documents on the table, the real one and the false one. Her father's intentions and the version of them that had tried to say she didn't exist here. How long? She said. Weeks, not months, Mr. Hadley said. The evidence is complete. What happens to your cousin and her husband, in terms of legal consequence, is a separate question, one I'd strongly recommend pursuing. He straightened his papers. The house is yours, the trust is yours, the ring, he paused. The ring we may need to address through a separate process. But I expect it will not be complicated once the broader matter is resolved. She looked at the Duke. He was looking at her with the same expression he'd had in the garden room the night she'd told him her name. Not quite readable, not quite opaque. Something in between, something she was beginning to learn the shape of. You don't have to stay here, he said, in the linen room. He said it without making it into more than it was. I know, she said, but I'd like to, until it's finished. She looked at the house around her, at the library that hadn't been touched, at the desk through the wall in the garden room, at the particular quality of a place that had been lived in honestly for a long time. "I'd like to be here when it's done." He nodded. "Then you should move to the east bedroom," he said. "It gets the better light." Mr. Hadley cleared his throat in the manner of a man who has observed something he is carefully not observing, and said he would be in touch by the end of the week. Vivian came on a Friday. Margot heard the carriage before she saw it. She was in the library. She had stopped pretending she was in the library in any professional capacity. The Duke had stopped requiring the pretense sometime around the third day after the meeting with Mr. Hadley, and she set down her book when she heard wheels on the drive and felt, without surprise, exactly what she'd expected to feel. Not fear. Something past fear that had been resolved into something else by 2 weeks of having a solicitor and a document and a Duke who had apparently decided, without announcing it, to proceed as though the outcome was not in question. She went to the window. Vivian was descending from the carriage with the composed bearing of a woman making a social call rather than one who had arrived without invitation. Her husband was not with her. Margot noted this. She went downstairs. The Duke was already in the entrance hall. "She'll want to see me," Margot said. "Yes," he said. "She'll have a version of things," Margot said. "She's very good at versions. She does them at conversational volume, and they're very difficult to argue with in the moment because they're just vague enough to be unprovable." "I know," he said. "You've never met her." "I've read her husband's correspondence," he said. "The letters he sent to the estate solicitor 6 months ago. He writes the same way. It's a learned quality, I think." He looked at her steadily. "Do you want to hear what she says, or would you rather I did?" She thought about it for a genuine moment. Then she said, "Let her in. I want to hear it." He let her in. They sat in the front parlor, the one Vivian's husband had redecorated, which gave Margot a somewhat grim satisfaction now. Vivian looked at Margot for a long moment when she walked in. Whatever she saw, she composed herself quickly. "Margot," she said, "when Fenton told me you were here, I couldn't quite believe it." "I expect not," Margot said. Vivian looked at the Duke, then back at Margot. "There's clearly been some misunderstanding of the situation," she said. "Fenton has always wanted what's best for you. The arrangement we made was meant to protect you. The estate is complicated. And you were so," she paused, choosing her word, "unsettled. After your father, I was grieving," Margot said. Of course you were. I only mean, we thought it would be overwhelming for you to manage alone. Fenton has resources you don't, connections you don't. He's been improving the property significantly. He replaced the curtains in the parlor," Margot said. "I noticed." Vivian looked at her. "There are documents," she said, more carefully now, dropping the softness by a small but measurable degree. "Your father's wishes were clear. The will was properly filed." "A will was filed," the Duke said. It was the first time he'd spoken. The quietness of it was exact, a brief silence. "The original will is with Mr. Hadley," Margot said, "along with a signed statement of my father's intentions, witnessed separately, and the findings of a document examiner who has reviewed the signatures on what was filed." Vivienne was still. The kind of still that was not composure exactly, but the arrest of a person who has just understood the dimensions of something. She looked at the Duke. Margot had watched people look at the Duke when they wanted to know if he was persuadable, if there was something to work with, if the situation might still be managed. She knew already what they found, because she had looked at him the same way once, in the first days, before she understood that there was nothing to read there except exactly what was true. "There's been an error somewhere," Vivian said, quieter now. "I'm sure if we all sat down with both solicitors—" "We have," the Duke said. "Mr. Hadley and I have been in correspondence for 6 weeks." Vivienne looked at him. Then she looked at Margot. Then she looked at the ring on her own hand. The room was very quiet. Margot looked at the ring. She didn't look away. She didn't say anything, because she didn't need to. Because some things were made clear by silence as surely as by speech. And the particular silence in that room said everything that needed to be said about what had been taken and what was coming back. Vivian left 20 minutes later. She said she would consult with Fenton. She said there were surely details that could be worked through, she said. At the door, in the diminished tone of a woman who had arrived to manage a situation and discovered it had already been managed without her, that she hoped they could resolve things without unpleasantness. The Duke said he hoped the same. Margot said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. After the carriage was gone, the Duke said, "She'll tell Fenton to engage a solicitor. Their solicitor already knows." Margot said, "Mr. Hadley told me. They've been asking questions for days." He looked at her. "Then they know how it ends. They know," she said. "They came to see if there was anything left to salvage." "Is there?" She thought about it honestly. About Vivian at the funeral, standing at the graveside with her mother's ring on her finger, not looking at Margot, looking instead at the house and the grounds with the focused assessment of a woman calculating square footage. She thought about the 2 years before her father's death when Vivian had been perfectly pleasant, had said all the right things, had seemed in every way like the harmless cousin she was supposed to be. She thought about what it cost to find out too late that pleasantness was a performance. "No," she said. "But she won't accept that until she sees it for herself." He nodded. "Come and look at what Mr. Hadley sent this morning," he said. "There are some details about the trust that want your attention." And she followed him into the library. Her father's library, her grandfather's library before that. The room that had waited in the middle of a house that had been taken from her and had somehow remained exactly what it was, intact, in current use, used well. And she sat down at the desk and looked at the documents and began, for the first time, in 5 months, to know precisely where she stood. The ring came back on a Tuesday. Margot did not make a significant occasion of it. She was in the garden room. She had taken to working there in the afternoons, at her mother's desk, which felt less like sentiment now and more like practicality, because the desk was good and the light was right. When Mrs. Tatum knocked and delivered a small box that had arrived with the Morning Post, accompanied by a letter from a firm she didn't recognize that contained, in 3 paragraphs of very careful legal language, the essential message that the matter was considered closed. She opened the box. She looked at the ring for a moment. Then she put it on and went back to what she was working on. The Duke found her there an hour later. He stopped in the doorway in the way he did now, with the ease of someone who had been crossing that particular threshold long enough to have stopped thinking about it. He looked at her hand. He said nothing, in the way he said nothing about things that were their own answer. "Mr. Hadley says the title transfer will be complete by Friday," she said. "I know. He wrote to me as well." He came in and sat down in the chair across from her. Outside, the October light was doing what it did best, arriving honest and low across the grounds, making everything look like itself. "What do you want to do with the east rooms?" Fenton's redecoration was, he paused. "Catastrophic," she said. "I was going to say thorough," he said. "But yes," she looked out the window. The grounds were the same. He hadn't touched the grounds. "Slowly," she said. "I want to do it slowly. I've been in a hurry about everything for 5 months, and I think the house deserves the patience." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a reasonable approach." "I thought you'd say that," she said. "You apply reason to everything." "Not to everything," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the window with the expression she had come to know, not quite readable, not quite closed, the expression of a man who has something more to say and is deciding on the correct moment for it. "The night I found the documents," he said, "in the false bottom of the drawer. I sat with them for a while before I wrote the note to you. I wasn't sure I had the right to say anything. It wasn't my house, and then you decided you did. I decided the alternative was worse," he said. He looked at her. "I've been wrong about a small number of things in my life. I am not wrong about what matters and what doesn't." She held his gaze. "And what matters?" He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the garden room the night she told him her name. Without performance, without arranging himself for her benefit, simply there, paying full attention. "That you're here," he said, "and that I asked rather than assumed because some things should be asked." She set her pen down. Outside the window, the grounds were still. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they have been waiting a long time and have finally stopped. "I'm here," she said. He nodded, once. As though she had answered something he had been thinking about for longer than either of them had named. He picked up the estate ledger that was on the side table and opened it and began to read, and she picked up her pen and went back to her letter. And they worked in the garden room, in the afternoon light, in the comfortable and serious quiet of two people who had stopped pretending they were strangers. In a house that had come back to the person who had always belonged to it, and was only now, after everything, beginning to feel like what it had always been.